Here we are again reading The Rights of Man by Thomas Paine. Last time we were talking about the vanity and presumption of governing beyond the grave, and how Paine was not in on that idea, and Burke was saying, heck yeah, don't you remember that one time back a couple hundred years ago, they determined that we don't have the right to change the law of the land. And dude's like, really? No. And then also he goes on to say, this is still Eric Foner speaking, because we're still in the introduction. And we have, and he held Burke's tortuous literary style up to ridicule. As the wandering audience whom Mr. Burke supposes himself talking to may not understand all his learned jargon, I will undertake to be its interpreter. 11 months after the first, a second part of Rights of Man appeared. While Part 1 had essentially been a defense of the French Revolution, Paine now outlined his general theory of government and society. Rights of Man Part 2 is probably Paine's greatest work and the finest example of political pamphleteering in the Age of Reason. As in Common Sense, Paine began with the distinction between society and government. Society, resting on its mutual needs and social affections of mankind, was natural and benevolent. Government, at least in the Old World, presented nothing more than a disgustful picture of human wretchedness. Echoing his description of William the Conqueror in Common Sense, Paine assailed the origin of monarchy in a band of ruffians whose chief contrived to lose the name of robber in that of monarch. He introduced English readers to American definitions of republican government and broke with the time-honored tradition of employing democracy as a synonym for anarchy, using it instead in its modern sense as a government reflecting the will of the majority. So far, little that Paine said was new, although he had never said it better. But suddenly, in Chapter 5, Paine unveiled his new vision, that of a republican state as an agent of the social welfare. Previously, Paine's radicalism had been essentially political. The hordes of miserable poor with which the old countries abound, he believed, were a consequence of bad government. Now, without completely breaking with the tradition... breaking with his earlier view, or challenging private property as an institution, he insisted that more than simply a transition to republicanism would be required to alleviate the plight of the European masses. Paine outlined a breathtaking economic program as close to a welfare state as could have been imagined in the 18th century. The basis of taxation would be changed from regressive levies on consumption to a progressive tax on landed property. From the proceeds, every poor family would receive funds to enable it to raise and educate its children. A system of social security would be established, enabling workers to retire on a pension at age 60. Public employment would be provided to those in need of work, and funds would be appropriated for a decent burial to those who died in poverty. At the same time, laws limiting wages would be abolished, since working men ought to be free to make their own bargains without the interference of a state. Are we still good? We're live. From all we now see, Paine had written on at the close of the first part of Rights of Man, nothing of reform in the political world ought to be held improbable. It is an age of revolutions in which everything may be looked for. And in response to his pamphlet seemed to fully justify Paine's optimism. And the response, excuse me. Rights of Man historian E.P. Thompson writes, became the foundation text of English working class movement. I cannot read articles, apparently. All right. In a population of 10 million, the two parts sold perhaps 250,000 copies within 2 years. Rights of Man transformed the English radical tradition, providing political reformers with an explicit social program, making the traditional demands for parliamentary reform meaningful to the daily lives of the lower classes. Some middle-class reformers embraced Paine's ideas through a more Some middle-class reformers embraced Paine's ideas, though more were appalled by his attack on the monarchy and his call for the working people to enter the stage of politics. But the places of those who deserted the ranks of reform were more than taken up by a new generation of artisan and lower-class radicals organized into corresponding societies throughout the British Isles. Paine freed such men to think in new and startling ways about the political and social order, to imagine for the first time a complete transformation of British life. There was little room in these societies for gradual constitutional reform, but much talk of utopian dreams of a better world. They accepted Paine's fervent conviction that the American and French revolutions demonstrated that constitutions could be drawn up from first principles. The dead weight of the past, Karl Marx once wrote, weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. Paine's mission was to free mankind from this burden. So too, Paine provided a radical sociology, a way of thinking about the social order that would remain characteristic of radical thought on both sides of the Atlantic well into the 19th century. As in America, Paine envisioned a society of small property owners, united voluntarily for the common good. Republican government would serve the interest of all classes. Indeed, it would create a society without the class conflict that wretched old world. That racked the old world. That wretched old world. But in this harmonious vision, one social group was missing. The landed aristocracy, which would be destroyed once its court-provided privileges were abolished. For Paine, society was not divided precisely between rich and poor, or between capital and labor, but between aristocracy and people, or as they would later be called, non-producers and producers. So the aristocracy are non-producers and the people are producers. Why does Mr. Burke talk of his House of Peers as the pillar of landed interest? Were that pillar to sink into the earth, the same landed property would continue, and the same plowing, sowing, and reaping would go on. The aristocracy are not the farmers who work the land, but are the mere consumers of rent. Not surprisingly, the response of the English government to the flames of revolution abroad and the threat of political upheaval at home was political repression. Paine himself was quickly indicted for seditious libel and fled to France to step ahead of the law. One step ahead of the law, so he made it out. By 1795, the radical societies had been crushed. It was symptomatic of the differences between British and American political culture at the close of the 18th century that Paine's ideas were outlawed in the former, but had become commonplace in the latter. Thomas Jefferson, who considered the pamphlet a formidable weapon against the political heresies which have sprung up among us, helped publicize the rights of man in America. John Adams' young son, John Quincy Adams, did publish a series of anonymous newspaper pieces attacking Paine, but few in America would disagree with Paine's defense of Republican government or his attack on monarchy. The French Revolution, by 1792, did divide American politics, but far more Americans seem to have responded favorably to the pamphlet than against it. As for the social chapter, which had the most profound impact in England, Paine himself did not believe his far-reaching proposals were relevant to America, where the problem of poverty was far less acute than in England. The ideas of rights of man did not seem dangerous in America because Thanks in part to Paine's earlier writings, they were already embedded into the common currency of political culture. Paine lived for 17 years after the publication of Rights of Man. In France, where he remained until 1802, his career entered its most problematic phase. Elected to the National Convention as a symbol of appreciation for his defense of the Revolution, Paine quickly found himself out of step with the rapidly changing political events. His political association, where am I at? His political associates were among Girondin faction. His political associates were among the Girondin faction, and their Wait. Oh, okay. I'm dumb. I just can't read a book. His political associates were among the Girondin faction, and with their fall, Paine found himself imprisoned in 1793. He transferred to the future. No, in 1793, in Luxembourg Palace, which now held he got imprisoned in 1793 in Luxembourg Palace, which now held opponents of the Jacobean regime. The Jacobin regime. I don't know much about history about that. I don't know who that is, but I don't know ideas are good. Alright. He remained there for 10 months in constant danger of execution. Released in 1794, he spent several unhappy years longing for an opportunity to return to America. Nonetheless, Paine in these years was able to compose his great last pamphlets, The Age of Reason and Agrarian Justice. The first was an exposition of deism and an attack on the basic principles of Christianity, rejecting the Bible as a revealed word of God and exalting reason and science as the modes of understanding the natural world. Reprinted in countless editions, the pamphlet became the most popular deist work ever written. It established Paine as an inspiration to 19th century free thinkers, but alienated devout believers who tarred Paine inaccurately with labels of infidel and atheist. His last great work, Agrarian Justice, published in 1796, criticized the accumulation of landed property in the hands of a few men of wealth as a major cause of poverty in Europe. Like so many of his other writings, it helped inspire an important strand of the 19th century radical tradition, land reform. In 1802, Paine finally got his wish, and at age 65 returned to America. He lived out the rest of his life in obscurity, contributing occasional essays to the Jeffersonian press, but finding himself under constant assault in this most evangelical of cultures for his deist writings. In his final years were ones of lonely private misery, in quotes, so he quoted that. Isolated from his old associates, drinking heavily, he died in 1809. 6 mourners attended the funeral of a man who once inspired millions to think in new ways about a world in which they lived, and his death passed virtually unnoticed in American press. What then was Paine's legacy? In England, as we have seen, his writings inspired the birth of a working-class radicalism to which Paine has remained a hero down to the present day. The former head of the Labour Party, Michael Foot, is also an honorary president of Britain's Thomas Paine Society. In America, it is difficult, however, to discern a sustained tradition of Paineite radicalism. But it would be wrong to underestimate Paine's impact on the evolution of American radical tradition. More than any other individual, it was Paine who defined the terms and created the political language of 19th century American radicalism. Even those who rejected his religious beliefs could not escape the impact of Paine's radical variant republicanism. Paine's writings provided a vision of a good society. a definition of active citizenship which helped inspire expressions of protest ranging from the labor movement of the 1830s to the populists of the 1890s. Thus, despite the fact that Paine as an individual was often forgotten, Paine's thought deeply affected the evolution of radicalism in the 19th century America. There were always those Americans, moreover, who found in Paine an abiding symbol of radical persona. Even while Paine pursued his checkered career as founding father of British radicalism and unhappy participant in revolutionary France, his writings had helped inspire the formation of democratic republican societies in the United States. Formed to promote the party of Jefferson and defend the French Revolution, the societies distributed copies of The Rights of Man and drank toasts to Paine as the quintessential opponent of aristocratic tyranny. The ranks of American Painites were reinforced by an influx of British radicals in the 1790s and in the early 19th century. Later in the 1830s, the early labor movement held dinners in honor of Paine's birthday. Thomas Skidmore, a leading figure in the New York Working Men's Party, published The Rights of Man to Property, whose title suggested both a tribute to Paine and the need to move beyond his analysis to extend political equality, which had been achieved in America, to the economic realm. Similarly, George Henry Evans, an immigrant British reformer, drew on agrarian justice to agitate the government to provide free homestead to the public on the public lands to any individual desiring to escape labor conditions in eastern cities. Later in the century, freethinkers like Robert Ingersoll and radical Democrats like Walt Whitman paid homage to Paine's memory. Later still, Eugene V. Debs hailed Paine as the founder of radical tradition, the man who said a share in two revolutions is living on some purpose. Despite Paine's exclusion from the list of revered revolutionary forebears in the culture at large, then his influence was indeed profound. More than any other individual, Paine, in his revolutionary internationalism, his rationalism and faith in human nature, his defiance of existing institutions, epitomized the radical cast of mind. His ideas and personal example have continued to inspire those who believe that the modern world has betrayed, not fulfilled, the high hopes for a just social order raised during Paine's age of revolution. Suggest some other readings. Here's a note on the text. The first edition of Rights of Man, Part 1, appeared in the beginning of February of 1791, but the publisher Johnson took fright and abandoned the project almost at once. Only a very few copies of this edition survive, one of them being in the British Museum. Thomas Paine then went to France, leaving the production in the hands of his friend William Godwin. William Godwin, Thomas Holcraft, and Thomas Hollis. They were responsible for the first edition to appear in significant numbers, which came out on March 13th of 1791. Published by J.S. Jordan of Fleet Street, Part 2 was also published by Jordan on February 17th of 1992. 1792. New editions from the same publisher followed fairly rapidly, and in the summer of 1792, Paine wrote that the high price precluded the generality of people from purchasing, and many applications were made to me from various parts of the country to print the work in a cheaper manner. He at once complied, and after the cheap editions became innumerable, and many applications were made from various parts of the country to print in a cheaper manner. He at once complied, and after the cheap editions came innumerable pirated editions, many of them severely defective. The present edition is reproduced from the 4th J.S. Jordan edition of Part 1, published in 1791, and the 6th edition of Part 2, which appeared in 1792. Differences among the earlier J.S. Jordan editions are not significant, and the editions printed here were selected because of clarity. The spelling has been modernized. Good to know. Here's the contents. We have Part 1, there's to George Washington, a preface to the English edition. The Rights of Man, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of Citizens by National Assembly of France. The Observations on the Declaration of Rights. And there's a miscellaneous chapter, as well as a conclusion. The Part 2 is made up of a letter to Marquis de Lafayette, a preface, an introduction, and chapters. There are chapter 1 of Society and of Civilization. 2 is the origin of the present old governments. 2 is of the old and new systems of governments. 4 is of constitutions. And 5 is ways and means of improving the condition of Europe, interspersed with miscellaneous observations. Okay, and then there's an appendix. We have a joyous time ahead of us, son. Part 1. We're going to call this Thomas Paine, The Rights of Man, Part 1 by Thomas Paine. So, how long have we been going? 21 minutes? Stop streaming. That gives us